Chapters 44 and 45 of A House of Gentlefolk by Ivan Turgenev, translated by Constance GARNETT. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 44. The following day was Sunday. The sound of bells ringing for early mass did not wake Lavretsky. He had not closed his eyes all night, but it reminded him of another Sunday, when at Lisa's desire he had gone to church. He got up hastily. Some secret voice told him that he would see her there today. He went noiselessly out of the house, leaving a message for Varvara Pavlovna that he would be back for dinner, and with long strides he made his way in the direction in which the monotonously mournful bells were calling him. He arrived early. There was scarcely anyone in the church. A deacon was reading the service in the choir. The measured drone of his voice, sometimes broken by a cough, fell and rose at even intervals. Lavretsky placed himself not far from the entrance. Worshippers came in one by one, stopped, crossed themselves, and bowed in all directions. Their steps rang out in the empty, silent church, echoing back distinctly under the arched roof. An infirm, poor little old woman in a worn-out cloak with a hood was on her knees near Lavretsky, praying assiduously. Her toothless, yellow, wrinkled face expressed intense emotion. Her red eyes were gazing fixedly upwards at the holy figures on the iconostasis. Her bony hand was constantly coming out from under her cloak, and slowly and earnestly making a great sign of the cross. A peasant with a bushy beard and a surly face, dishevelled and unkempt, came into the church and at once fell on both knees and began directly crossing himself in haste, bending back his head with a shake after each prostration. Such bitter grief was expressed in his face and in all his actions that Lavretsky made up his mind to go up to him and ask him what was wrong. The peasant timidly and morosely started back, looked at him. "My son is dead," he articulated quickly, and again fell to bowing to the earth. What could replace the consolations of the church to them, thought Lavretsky, and he tried himself to pray, but his heart was hard and heavy, and his thoughts were far away. He kept expecting Lisa, but Lisa did not come. The church began to be full of people, but still she was not there. The service commenced, the deacon had already read the gospel, they began ringing for the last prayer. Lavretsky moved a little forward and suddenly caught sight of Lisa. She had come before him, but he had not seen her. She was hidden in a recess between the wall and the choir, and neither moved nor looked round. Lavretsky did not take his eyes off her till the very end of the service. He was saying farewell to her. The people began to disperse, but she still remained. It seemed as though she were waiting for Lavretsky to go out. At last she crossed herself for the last time and went out. There was only a maid with her, not turning round. Lavretsky went out of the church after her and overtook her in the street. She was walking very quickly with downcast head and a veil over her face. "Good morning, Lizaveta Mikhailovna," he said aloud with assumed carelessness. "May I accompany you?" She made no reply. He walked beside her. "Are you content with me?" he asked her, dropping his voice. "Have you heard what happened yesterday?" "Yes, yes," she replied in a whisper. "That was well." And she went still more quickly. "Are you content?" Lisa only bent her head in assent. "Fyodor Ivanich," she began in a calm but faint voice, "I wanted to beg you not to come to see us any more. Go away as soon as possible. We may see each other again later, sometime in a year, but now do this for my sake. Fulfill my request, for God's sake." "I am ready to obey you in everything, Lizaveta Mikhailovna, But are we really to part like this? Will you not say one word to me?
Fyodor Ivanych, you are walking near me now, but already you are so far from me. And not only you, but...
Speak out, I entreat you, cried Lavretsky.
What do you mean? You will hear perhaps, but whatever it may be, forget... No, do not forget. Remember me.
Me forget you?
That's enough. Goodbye. Do not come after me.
Lisa, Lavretsky was beginning.
Goodbye. Goodbye,
she repeated, pulling her veil still lower and almost running forward. Lavretsky looked after her, and with bowed head turned back along the street. He stumbled up against Lem, who was also walking along with his eyes on the ground and his hat pulled down to his nose. They looked at one another without speaking.
"Well, what have you to say?"
Lavretsky brought out at last.
"What have I to say?" returned Lem grimly. "I have nothing to say. All is dead, and we are dead. Alles ist tot, und wir sind tot. So you are going to the right, are you?"
"Yes."
"And I to the left. Goodbye."
The following morning Fyodor Ivanitch set off with his wife for Lavriky. She drove in front in the carriage with Ada and Justine, he behind in the coach. The pretty little girl did not move away from the window the whole journey. She was astonished at everything: the peasants, the women, the wheels, the yokes over the horses' heads, the bells and the flocks of crows. Justine shared her wonder. Varvara Pavlovna laughed at their remarks and exclamations. She was in excellent spirits. Before leaving the town she had come to an explanation with her husband.
"I understand your position,"
she said to him, and from the look in her subtle eyes he was able to infer that she understood his position fully.
"But you must do me at least this justice, that I am easy to live with. I will not fetter you or hinder you. I wanted to secure Ada's future. I want nothing more."
"Well, you have obtained your object," observed Fyodor Ivanitch.
"I only dream of one thing now, to hide myself for ever in obscurity. I shall remember your goodness always."
"Enough of that," he interrupted.
"And I shall know how to respect your independence and tranquillity,"
she went on, completing the phrases she had prepared. Lavretsky made her a low bow. Varvara Pavlovna then believed her husband was thanking her in his heart. On the evening of the next day they reached Lavriky. A week later Lavretsky set off for Moscow, leaving his wife 5,000 roubles for her household expenses, and the day after Lavretsky's departure Panshin made his appearance. Varvara Pavlovna had begged him not to forget her in her solitude. She gave him the best possible reception, and, till a late hour of the night, the lofty apartments of the house and even the garden re-echoed with the sound of music, singing, and lively French talk. For 3 days Varvara Pavlovna entertained Panshin. When he took leave of her, warmly pressing her lovely hands, he promised to come back very soon, and he kept his word. Chapter 45. Lisa had a room to herself on the second story of her mother's house, a clean, bright little room with a little white bed, with pots of flowers in the corners and before the windows, a small writing table, a bookstand, and a crucifix on the wall. It was always called the nursery. Lisa had been born in it. When she returned from the church where she had seen Lavretsky, she set everything in her room in order more carefully than usual, dusted it everywhere, looked through and tied up with ribbon all her copybooks and the letters of her girl-friends, shut up all the drawers, watered the flowers, and caressed every blossom with her hand. All this she did without haste, noiselessly, with a kind of rapt and gentle solicitude on her face. She stopped at last in the middle of the room, slowly looked round, and going up to the table above which the crucifix was hanging, she fell on her knees, dropped her head on to her clasped hands, and remained motionless. Marfa Timofyevna came in and found her in this position. Lisa did not observe her entrance. The old lady stepped out on tiptoe and coughed loudly several times outside the door. Lisa rose quickly and wiped her eyes, which were bright with unshed tears.
"Ah, I see you have been setting yourself to rights again,"
observed Marfa Timofyevna, and she bent low over a young rose tree in a pot.
"How nice it smells!"
Lisa looked thoughtfully at her aunt. "How strange you should use that word," she murmured.
"What word, eh?"
the old lady returned quickly.
"What do you mean? This is horrible."
She began, suddenly flinging off her cap and sitting down on Lisa's little bed.
"It is more than I can bear. This is the 4th day now that I have been boiling over inside. I can't pretend not to notice any longer. I can't see you getting pale and fading away and weeping. I can't.
"Why, what's the matter, auntie?" said Lisa.
"It's nothing." "Nothing!"
cried Marfa Timofyevna.
"You may tell that to others, but not to me. Nothing. Who was on her knees just this minute? And whose eyelashes are still wet with tears? Nothing indeed. Why, look at yourself. What have you done with your face? What has become of your eyes? Nothing. Do you suppose I don't know all?"
"It will pass off, auntie. Give me time."
"It will pass off, but when? Good God, merciful Saviour! Can you have loved him like this? Why, he's an old man, Lisa, darling. There, I don't dispute he's a good fellow, no harm in him, but what of that? We are all good people. The world is not so small. There will be always plenty of that commodity. I tell you, it will all pass away. It has all passed away already. Listen, Lisa, darling, what I am going to say to you."
Marfa Timofyevna said suddenly, making Lisa sit beside her and straightening her hair and her neckerchief.
"It seems to you now, in the midst of the worst of it, that nothing can ever heal your sorrow. Ah, my darling, the only thing that can't be cured is death. You only say to yourself now, 'I won't give in to it, so there.' And you'll be surprised yourself how soon, how easily it will pass off. Only have patience." "Auntie," returned Lisa, "it has passed off already. It is all over." "Passed? How has it passed? Why, your poor little nose has grown sharp already, and you say it is over. A fine way of getting over it."
"Yes, it is over, auntie. If you will only try to help me," Lisa declared with sudden animation, and she flung herself on Marfa Timofyevna's neck.
"Dear auntie, be a friend to me, help me, don't be angry, understand me." "Why, what is it? What is it, my good girl? Don't terrify me, please. I shall scream directly. Don't look at me like that. Tell me quickly, what is it?" I want," Lisa hid her face on Marfa Timofyevna's bosom. "I want to go into a convent," she articulated faintly.
The old lady almost bounded off the bed.
"Cross yourself, my girl, Lisa dear. Think what you're saying. What are you thinking of? God have mercy on you," she stammered at last. "Lie down, my darling, sleep a little. All this comes from sleeplessness, my dearie."
Lisa raised her head. Her cheeks were glowing.
"No, auntie," she said, "don't speak like that. I have made up my mind. I prayed, I asked counsel of God. All is at an end. My life with you is at an end. Such a lesson was not for nothing. And it is not the first time that I have thought of it. Happiness was not for me.
Even when I had hopes of happiness, my heart was always heavy. I knew all my own sins and those of others, and how papa made our fortune. I know it all. For all that there must be expiation. I am sorry for you, sorry for mamma, for Lenotchka, but there is no help. I feel that there is no living here for me. I have taken leave of all. I have greeted everything in the house for the last time. Something calls to me. I am sick at heart. I want to hide myself away forever. Do not hinder me, do not dissuade me, help me, or else I must go away alone. Marfa Timofyevna listened to her niece with horror. She is ill, she is raving, she thought. We must send for a doctor, but for which one? Gedeonovsky was praising one the other day. He always tells lies, but perhaps this time he spoke the truth. But when she was convinced that Lisa was not ill and was not raving, when she was constantly made the same answer to all her expostulations, Marfa Timofyevna was alarmed and distressed in earnest. "But you don't know, my darling," she began to reason with her, "what a life it is in those convents. Why, they would feed you, my own, on green hemp oil, and they would put you in the coarsest linen, and make you go about in the cold. You will never be able to bear all that, Lisa, darling. All this is Agafya's doing, she led you astray. But then, you know, she began by living and lived for her own pleasure. You must live too. At least let me die in peace, and then do as you like. And who has ever heard of such a thing? For the sake of a goat's beard, God forgive us, for the sake of a man, to go into a convent. Why, if you are so sick at heart, go on a pilgrimage, offer prayers to some saint, have a Te Deum sung, but don't put the black hood on your head, my dear creature, my good girl." And Marfa Timofyevna wept bitterly. Lisa comforted her, wiped away her tears and wept herself, but remained unshaken. In her despair Marfa Timofyevna had recourse to threats, to tell her mother all about it. But that too was of no avail. Only at the old lady's most earnest entreaties Lisa agreed to put off carrying out her plan for 6 months. Marfa Timofyevna was obliged to promise in return that if, within 6 months, she did not change her mind, she would herself help her and would do all she could to gain Marya Dmitrievna's consent. In spite of her promise to bury herself in seclusion, at the first approach of cold weather Varvara Pavlovna, having provided herself with funds, removed to Petersburg, where she took a modest but charming set of apartments, found for her by Panshin, who had left the O district a little before. During the latter part of his residence in O, he had completely lost Marya Dmitrievna's good graces. He had suddenly given up visiting her and scarcely stirred from Lavriky. Varvara Pavlovna had enslaved him, literally enslaved him. No other word can describe her boundless, irresistible, unquestioned sway over him. Lavretsky spent the winter in Moscow, and in the spring of the following year the news reached him that Lisa had taken the veil in the B convent, in one of the remote parts of Russia. End of chapters 44 and 45. Epilogue of A House of Gentlefolk by Ivan Turgenev, translated by Constance Garnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Epilogue. 8 years had passed by, once more the spring had come, but we will say a few words first of the fate of Mihalevitch, Panshin, and Madame Lavretsky, and then take leave of them. Mihalevitch, after long wanderings, has at last fallen in with exactly the right work for him. He has received the position of senior superintendent of a government school. He is very well content with his lot. His pupils adore him, though they mimic him too. Panshin has gained great advancement in rank, and already has a directorship in view. He walks with a slight stoop, caused doubtless by the weight round his neck of the Vladimir Cross which has been conferred on him. The official in him has finally gained the ascendancy over the artist. His still youngish face has grown yellow and his hair scanty. He now neither sings nor sketches, but applies himself in secret to literature. He has written a comedy in the style of a proverb, and as nowadays all writers have to draw a portrait of someone or something, he has drawn in it the portrait of a coquette, and he reads it privately to 2 or 3 ladies who look kindly upon him. He has, however, not entered upon matrimony, though many excellent opportunities of doing so have presented themselves. For this Varvara Pavlovna was responsible. As for her, she lives constantly at Paris, as in former days. Fyodor Ivanitch has given her a promissory note for a large sum, and has so secured immunity from the possibility of her making a second sudden descent upon him. She has grown older and stouter, but is still charming and elegant. Every one has his ideal. Varvara Pavlovna found hers in the dramatic works of Monsieur Dumas fils. She diligently frequents the theatres when consumptive and sentimental dames or camélias are brought on the stage. To be Madame Doche seems to her the height of human bliss. She once declared that she did not desire a better fate for her own daughter. It is to be hoped that fate will spare Mademoiselle Ada from such happiness. From a rosy-cheeked, chubby child she has turned into a weak-chested, pale girl. Her nerves are already deranged. The number of Varvara Pavlovna's adorers has diminished, but she still has some. A few she will probably retain to the end of her days. The most ardent of them in these later days is a certain Zakurdalo Skubrinikov, a retired guardsman, a full-bearded man of 38, of exceptionally vigorous physique. The French habitués of Madame Lavretsky's salon call him le gros taureau de l'Ukraine. Varvara Pavlovna never invites him to her fashionable evening reunions, but he is in the fullest enjoyment of her favors. And so 8 years have passed by. Once more the breezes of spring breathed brightness and rejoicing from the heavens. Once more spring was smiling upon the earth and upon men. Once more under her caresses everything was turning to blossom, to love, to song. The town of O had undergone little change in the course of these 8 years, but Marya Dmitrievna's house seemed to have grown younger. Its freshly painted walls gave a bright welcome, and the panes of its open windows were crimson, shining in the setting sun. From these windows the light, merry sound of ringing young voices and continual laughter floated into the street. The whole house seemed astir with life and brimming over with gaiety. The lady of the house herself had long been in her tomb. Marya Dmitrievna had died 2 years after Lisa took the veil, and Marfa Timofeevna had not long survived her niece. They lay side by side in the cemetery of the town. Nastasya Karpovna too was no more. For several years the faithful old woman had gone every week to say a prayer over her friend's ashes. Her time had come, and now her bones too lay in the damp earth. But Marya Dmitrievna's house had not passed into strangers' hands, it had not gone out of her family, the home had not been broken up. Lenotchka transformed into a slim, beautiful young girl, and her betrothed lover, a fair-haired officer of hussars. Marya Dmitrievna's son, who had just been married in Petersburg, and had come with his young wife for the spring to O. His wife's sister, a schoolgirl of 16, with glowing cheeks and bright eyes, Shurotchka, grown up and also pretty, made up the young household, whose laughter and talk set the walls of the Kalitins' house resounding. Everything in the house was changed, everything was in keeping with its new inhabitants. Beardless servant lads, grinning and full of fun, had replaced the sober old servants of former days. 2 setter dogs dashed wildly about and gambolled over the sofas where the fat Roska had at one time waddled in solemn dignity. The stables were filled with slender racers, spirited carriage horses, fiery outriders with plaited manes, and riding horses from the Don. The breakfast, dinner, and supper hours were all in confusion and disorder. In the words of the neighbors, unheard of arrangements were made. On the evening of which we are speaking, the inhabitants of the Kalitins' house, the eldest of them, Lenotchka's betrothed, was only 24, were engaged in a game which, though not of a very complicated nature, was, to judge from their merry laughter, exceedingly entertaining to them. They were running about the rooms, chasing one another, the dogs too were running and barking, and the canaries, hanging in cages above the windows, were straining their throats in rivalry and adding to the general uproar by the shrill trilling of their piercing notes. At the very height of this deafening merrymaking, a mud-bespattered carriage stopped at the gate, and a man of 45, in a travelling dress, stepped out of it and stood still in amazement. He stood a little time without stirring, watching the house with attentive eyes, then went through the little gate in the courtyard and slowly mounted the steps. In the hall he met no one, but the door of a room was suddenly flung open, and out of it rushed Shurotchka, flushed and hot, and instantly with a ringing shout, all the young party in pursuit of her. They stopped short at once and were quiet at the sight of a stranger, but their clear eyes fixed on him wore the same friendly expression, and their fresh faces were still smiling as Marya Dmitrievna's son went up to the visitor and asked him cordially what he could do for him. "I am Lavretsky," replied the visitor. He was answered by a shout in chorus, and not because these young people were greatly delighted at the arrival of a distant, almost forgotten relation,
but simply because they were ready to be delighted and make noise at every opportunity.
They surrounded Lavretsky at once. Lenotchka, as an old acquaintance, was the first to mention her own name, and assured him that in a little while she would have certainly recognized him. She presented him to the rest of the party, calling each, even her betrothed, by their pet names. They all trooped through the dining room into the drawing room. The walls of both rooms had been repapered, but the furniture remained the same. Lavretsky recognized the piano. Even the embroidery frame in the window was just the same, and in the same position, and it seemed with the same unfinished embroidery on it as 8 years ago. They made him sit down in a comfortable armchair, all sat down politely in a circle round him. Questions, exclamations, and anecdotes followed. "It's a long time since we have seen you," observed Lenotchka simply, "and Varvara Pavlovna we have seen nothing of either." "Well, no wonder," her brother hastened to interpose. "I carried you off to Petersburg, and Fyodor Ivanich has been living all the time in the country." "Yes, and mamma died soon after then." "And Marfa Timofyevna," observed Shurotchka. "And Nastasya Karpovna," added Lenotchka. "And Monsieur Lem." "What? Is Lem dead?" inquired Lavretsky. "Yes," replied young Kalitin. "He left here for Odessa. They say someone enticed him there, and there he died." "You don't happen to know, did he leave any music?" "I don't know, not very likely." All were silent and looked about them. A slight cloud of melancholy flitted over all the young faces. "But Matros is alive," said Lenotchka suddenly. "And Gedeonovsky," added her brother. At Gedeonovsky's name a merry laugh broke out at once. Yes, he is alive, and as great a liar as ever," Marya Dmitrievna's son continued. "And only fancy, yesterday this madcap," pointing to the schoolgirl, his wife's sister, "put some pepper in his snuff box." "How did he sneeze?" cried Lenotchka, and again there was a burst of unrestrained laughter. "We have had news of Lisa lately," observed young Kalitin, and again a hush fell upon all. "There was good news of her; she is recovering her health a little now." "She is still in the same convent?" Lavretsky asked, not without some effort.
"Yes, still in the same."
"Does she write to you?"
"No, never, but we get news through other people."
A sudden and profound silence followed. "A good angel is passing over," all were thinking.
"Wouldn't you like to go into the garden?" said Kalitin, turning to Lavretsky. "It is very nice now, though we have let it run wild a little."
Lavretsky went into the garden, and the first thing that met his eyes was the very garden seat on which he had once spent with Lisa those few blissful moments, never repeated. It had grown black and warped, but he recognized it, and his soul was filled with that emotion, unequalled for sweetness and for bitterness, the emotion of keen sorrow for vanished youth, for the happiness which has once been possessed. He walked along the avenues with the young people. The lime trees looked hardly older or taller in the 8 years, but their shade was thicker. On the other hand, all the bushes had sprung up, the raspberry bushes had grown strong, the hazels were a tangled thicket, and from all sides rose the fresh scent of the trees and grass and lilac.
"This would be a nice place for Puss in the Corner,"
cried Lenotchka suddenly, as they came upon a small green lawn surrounded by lime trees.
"And we're just 5 too."
"Have you forgotten Fyodor Ivanich?" replied her brother.
"Or didn't you count yourself?"
Lenotchka blushed slightly.
"But would Fyodor Ivanich at his age?"
she began. "Please, play your games," Lavretsky hastened to interpose. "Don't pay attention to me. I shall be happier myself when I am sure I am not in your way. And there is no need for you to entertain me. We old fellows have an occupation which you know nothing of yet, and which no amusement can replace. Our memories." The young people listened to Lavretsky with polite but rather ironical respect, as though a teacher were giving them a lesson, and suddenly they all dispersed and ran to the lawn. 4 stood near trees, 1 in the middle, and the game began. And Lavretsky went back into the house, went into the dining room, drew near the piano, and touched one of the keys. It gave out a faint but clear sound. On that note had begun the inspired melody with which long ago on that same happy night Lemm, the dead Lemm, had thrown him into such transports. Then Lavretsky went into the drawing room, and for a long time he did not leave it. In that room, where he had so often seen Lisa, her image rose most vividly before him. He seemed to feel the traces of her presence round him. But his grief for her was crushing, not easy to bear; it had none of the peace which comes with death. Lisa still lived somewhere, hidden and afar. He thought of her as of the living, but he did not recognize the girl he had once loved in that dim pale shadow, cloaked in a nun's dress and encircled in misty clouds of incense. Lavretsky would not have recognized himself could he have looked at himself as mentally he looked at Lisa. In the course of these 8 years he had passed that turning point in life which many never pass, but without which no one can be a good man to the end. He had really ceased to think of his own happiness, of his personal aims. He had grown calm and, why hide the truth, he had grown old not only in face and in body, he had grown old in heart. To keep a young heart up to old age, as some say, is not only difficult but almost ridiculous. He may well be content who has not lost his belief in goodness, his steadfast will, and his zeal for work. Lavretsky had good reason to be content. He had become actually an excellent farmer. He had really learned to cultivate the land, and his labors were not only for himself, he had, to the best of his powers, secured on a firm basis the welfare of his peasants. Lavretsky went out of the house into the garden and sat down on the familiar garden seat. And on this loved spot, facing the house where for the last time he had vainly stretched out his hand for the enchanted cup which frothed and sparkled with the golden wine of delight, he, a solitary homeless wanderer, looked back upon his life, while the joyous shouts of the younger generation who were already filling his place floated across the garden to him. His heart was sad, but not weighed down, nor bitter. Much there was to regret, nothing to be ashamed of. "Play away, be gay, grow strong, vigorous youth," he thought, and there was no bitterness in his meditations. "Your life is before you, and for you life will be easier. You have not, as we had, to find out a path for yourselves, to struggle, to fall, and to rise again in the dark. We had enough to do to last out, and how many of us did not last out? But you need only do your duty, work away, and the blessing of an old man be with you. For me, after today, after these emotions, there remains to take my leave at last, and though sadly, without envy, without any dark feelings, to say, in sight of the end, in sight of God who awaits me, 'Welcome, lonely old age, burn out useless life.'" Lavretsky quietly rose and quietly went away. No one noticed him, no one detained him. The joyous cries sounded more loudly in the garden behind the thick green wall of high lime trees. He took his seat in the carriage and bade the coachman drive home and not hurry the horses. And the end, perhaps the dissatisfied reader will inquire. What became of Lavretsky afterwards, and of Lisa? But what is there to tell of people who, though still alive, have withdrawn from the battlefield of life? They say Lavretsky visited that remote convent where Lisa had hidden herself, that he saw her. Crossing over from choir to choir, she walked close past him, moving with the even, hurried, but meek walk of a nun, and she did not glance at him, only the eyelashes on the side towards him quivered a little, only she bent her emaciated face lower, and the fingers of her clasped hands, entwined with her rosary, were pressed still closer to one another. What were they both thinking? What were they feeling? Who can know? Who can say? There are such moments in life, there are such feelings. One can but point to them and pass them by. End of A House of Gentlefolk by Ivan Turgenev, translated by Constance Garnett. Recorded by tovarisch.